Thank you so very much for that presentation. So now we turn to a time for members of the committee to ask some questions with our two speakers. We are unmuting some of you, but please check before you start speaking to see if you are unmuted. You can unmute yourself by clicking on the microphone icon that is next to your name or your call-in number. And with that, it's Q&A time. Any initial questions for Dr. Hope and or Dr. Vaughn?
Bruce and Trina, this is Wayne. My question is regarding the non-indigenous species literature. Was that, I didn't see a whole lot of reference to that. Do you have any, was it just not helpful, or is it too similar to the chemical risk assessment? How useful do you think that would be to do more investigation of?
This is Trina. Yeah, that literature does exist, and to some extent, the invasive species is sort of analogous to that. I think the thing about that is that the technologies used to evaluate unintended consequences are very different in this context than in that context. I think overall, in terms of computational frameworks, such as the Bayesian networks and things like that, that are used to evaluate those kinds of consequences, that is very helpful and can be very useful. But the specific details about how those probabilities are evaluated will naturally differ quite a bit between this kind of technology evaluation and something like a non-indigenous species evaluation. But absolutely, there are parallels, and particularly in terms of computational frameworks rather than specific details. It seems in this context that we're really interested in molecular changes associated with genetic variability, and then there are unintended genomic changes as a result of that. What I see in this literature that I see less in the non-indigenous or invasive species literature is the use of hypothesis-driven evaluations of unintended effects, and I don't see that quite as much there, and that seems to be a useful framework that people are thinking about in this context. And then, of course, the use of emerging technologies, and this would be different kinds of high-throughput screening and various other omics-type technologies that are somewhat used in non-indigenous species but are clearly relevant in this context. So I would say the computational frameworks is really where the greatest overlap is, and there's lots of different ways to do it. But as you may know, as I think you as well are interested in, these kinds of conditional probability tables and things like that, where we have an event that is conditioned on some previous events occurring, can be a really useful way to actually generate the kind of probabilities that are useful for decision making. I don't know, Bruce, did you have any perspective on that?
Well, one perspective I have is that it's a little easier to conceptualize this with whole animals. I looked at the invasive species literature going back to the cane toads in Australia, and there's plenty of examples of whole animals getting away, and that becomes an exercise in fairly well understood population biology. It's, as I said, it's not clear that this technology, if used as intended, would have those kind of effects. And so it seems to be a more subtle, perhaps not fully characterized set of possibilities. So I think that the invasive literature I looked at and am familiar with, it raises a cautionary tale about unintended consequences, which is why I put it in as a takeaway. But it isn't exactly useful directly to the issue of changes at the molecular level, which are supposed to stay within a specific target population.
So Bruce and Trini, oh, go ahead. Go ahead.
No, go ahead. That's all right. This is Jim Collins. Go ahead.
Jim already had a turn. Go ahead.
All right. Thanks very much to both of you for really interesting presentations. And you both emphasized the idea of using quantitative methods, although then Dr. Hope went into talking about the possibility of using stories of a certain sort in order to drive the decision-making process. Could you say a little bit more about that and how one would assess the value of one story or one way of thinking about things as opposed to another?
Yeah, I can actually send Dr. Sawyer a copy of a paper we wrote a couple of years ago on this, and you can share it if you want.
That'd be great.
Yeah, the basic idea here is to elucidate cause and effect. In other words, he can go in either direction. I see an effect, what caused it, or I'm about to do something which constitutes a cause, or what effect might that have? And early on with ecological risk grew out of the Superfund program and chemical releases and whatever. So it was, I've got this chemical environment, that's my cause, what effect is it having? Over time, and frankly, for many years, it was simply, well, I measure this amount in the environment and I measure this amount and I compare that to a dose-response result for the critter, and the two are, where they are relative to one another constitutes whether there's a problem. About 10 or 15 years ago, it became obvious to people that, and this grew largely out of EPA's CADIS program. It's programmed to look at causes and effects of detriment to water quality, which can come from many sources, sometimes multiple sources, isn't limited to chemicals. And the question became, if I go to a water body and I find a distressed condition, what caused it? I mean, I see an effect. What's the cause of that effect? And that type of thinking gets you to fault trees, and it gets you to narratives like, an awful lot of stuff about water quality can be reduced to numbers. I mean, a certain amount of dissolved oxygen can be related to adverse effects on fish and so on. But when I meant narrative, it's sometimes cause and effect is not easily reduced to a number, but there is knowledge in the ecological community that says, well, if I have a water body, I'm using water quality as an example here, but one example is that if I have a stream and I remove the streamside vegetation, I'm going to see adverse effects on the fish because of lack of hiding places, which may not be readily quantifiable, increases in water temperature, which I can't quantify, greater predation. In other words, there are narrative descriptions of cause and effect relationships that help you explain why, if I, say, for example, remove this vegetation from the stream side, should be expecting fewer salmon in that stream in years ahead. So you have these lines of evidence, loss of vegetation, increases in predation and so on, that you put together, so you have multiple lines of evidence, some quantitative, some narrative. You put these together in a framework, and that weight of evidence helps inform decision making. And it works for ecology because ecology is not yet completely reducible to a few simple numeric estimates. And it also, weight of evidence also helps when you're dealing with something for which we do not have a lot of experience. So we don't necessarily have data at hand that allows us to do calculations. Yet we believe, and based on an intrinsic understanding of the system. We believe that if we do X, Y might result, or so on. So weight of evidence allows you to bring more pieces of information of different types. It's somewhat analogous to decision analytics, where you can bring different types of information with different metrics together to try to inform a decision. And it probably make more sense. I will send Dr. Sawyer a copy of that paper when we're finished here, and she can pass it around. And it was written in the context of how you would apply weight of evidence to in EPA's ecological risk framework. So it's very consistent with the way things are done at the federal level.
Thank you.
This is Greg Kaebnick, and I've got a question about the risk perception stuff. Am I unmuted? Can I be heard?
Yeah.
All right, great. So I found it very helpful that you brought this up, but I wasn't quite clear what you want to end up doing with it as a risk assessor. I take it that you depend a little bit on stakeholder input, but by noting these problems with risk, these issues, questions about risk perception, you're raising a question about the reliability of some of that input, about how it squares with the world as it is. So there's a sense in which you want to start with the stakeholders, but you also sort of want to clean up their perceptions in a little bit. Is that right? Can you tell me about how you think about it?
Well, I think you need to honor their perception. I mean, we know that these perceptions are there. I mean, individuals won the Nobel Prize in economics for elucidating the heuristics of people's perception of things and how it guides their decisions. So, my number one point is you simply have to acknowledge that those exist. And if your goal is to reach the best decisions for the broadest population, number of people, you need to recognize that those perceptions are there. I'm not talking about manipulating those perceptions, but it's clear that if you start off on the wrong foot, if you don't respect them and you simply start with, well, we did a scientific analysis and it says everything's okay, so let's get going here, it's not going to go well. So it's a matter, the perception side of risk, the perception side of decision making, where there are probabilities of good and bad outcomes, is one you need to recognize at the get-go. And I don't like to use the word manage, but you need to be sensitive to how you convey your results and how the folks you're speaking to are going to respond to how you convey those results. In other words, you can defeat decision-making if you may have done a great scientific analysis, and it's got great peer review, and it's bioethically it's unchallenged, and it's just you know you're right. You know that you're not evil here, and yet you roll it out and you do it in a way that doesn't respect the stakeholders and constituents' perceptions of things, and it just blows up in your face. And so that's all I was trying to get at here is if you recognize that it's about decisions, decisions are all good and bad, people's perception of what's good and what's bad vary, and yes, they can be educated, they can be informed about what's going on, about the good and the bad, about what you think is good and why it's good, and that you have looked at the bad and why it's not as bad as people might believe. Certainly information is very important here, but and so it's respecting stakeholders and constituencies, their perception of things. It's being willing to engage in an informational, non-judgmental informational perspective, and it's as important not to not do those. If you don't do those first two things, then your decision is not going to be it's going to be difficult. You may end up with a decision that you don't want, and it's maybe the wrong decision, because people perceived of inequities in what you were doing and you didn't convey it correctly and so on. So over the course of my career, as I said, I've done the calculations, I do the science, that's what's more comfortable with that than anything else. I learned the hard way, though, that if you don't consider risk perception and risk communication as key components to actually reaching a decision, a good decision for most people, all that science is not going to win out. So that's the point I was trying to make.
Okay, thank you.
Greg, may I this is Liz Heitman. I'd like to follow up on your question with a variation on that same theme. We heard from an international panel in the workshop that we had last Wednesday that the West places too much emphasis on risk, whereas developing countries tend to see benefit in both new technologies in general and potentially in gene drive technology specifically. Are there different cultural perspectives on the science of risk assessment? And I think all of the literature that we have seen has been American on risk assessment specifically and definitions of processes. Is there much variation around the world, or is most of this science based in U.S. and European perspectives?
Well,
that would be for both speakers, please.
Yeah. Well, I wrote a paper about 5 or 6 years ago where I was asked to write a review of international ecological risk methods, and a lot of it grew. Yeah, I can send that along too. It was Glenn Suter and the folks that he was at Oak Ridge at the time, but later at EPA. I mean, he basically, and folks in his group, got it started. And so if you look at internationally an ecological risk, a lot of it starts from there and spreads outward. So there's a very Western cultural perspective to it all. A lot of countries have tweaked it slightly, and the Europeans, of course, made it more elaborate. But, and I'm not really the one, Trina's better positioned here, but I do think, at least in the United States, as I said at the beginning, risk is, use the word risk, you're saying something bad's going to happen. And a lot of new chemicals, new technologies, new things, for some segments of the population, are viewed as bad. They're too risky. And we don't look at the benefits. Because quite frankly, we take the benefits for granted. A lot of folks in the West, in the developed countries, aren't living that close to the edge. We're not going to starve to death tomorrow. So the benefits are sort of out there, and also we focus on the risk. And I would think in other parts of the world where perhaps you're closer to the edge and someone walks in with something that has a benefit, a big benefit from your perspective, you might think that's a good thing and not be so concerned about, because you're taking plenty of risks every day, and someone offers you something with clear benefits to you, but that comes to perception. Western developed countries might not perceive of a decision, the risks and benefits, the benefits and detriments of the decision in the same way that someone in a developing country or in more straitened circumstances would view it.
Thank you.
So that's just my perspective.
Oh, this is Trina. I would just follow up on that and say, in terms of the mechanics of calculating risk, I think that is fairly consistent. It sort of, as Bruce said, originated, I think, in the West or in the States, but there's those kind of frameworks and the way in which risks are calculated is fairly consistent throughout the world. It's, again, just to sort of re-emphasize or emphasize again, that it's the perception and the perspective of what the priorities are that differs in different cultures. The actual mechanics, I wouldn't say differs really at all. It's, you want to find the most appropriate computational framework for the kind of risk that you're assessing. Maybe that's a a Bayesian network, or maybe it's just kind of simple algebra where similar to what I showed initially, where you're just multiplying some numbers together. There's different ways of calculating, and those are all fairly consistent. But there are certainly big differences in how risks are perceived across different cultures, and that's where the tricky part comes in. And relating to what we were just talking about risk perception, one thing this is challenging in the context of national policy development and that kind of thing, but certainly my experience has always been communicating early with the stakeholders and the people who are going to be potentially impacted by whatever is being analyzed, having that communication and understanding what their concerns are, even if you know scientifically that's really not an issue. I can say without doing the analysis that's actually not going to be a problem. But understanding that that is their concern and being able to actually address that and be responsive to it builds that communication that goes both ways that then facilitates the acceptance of the result then when you do the calculation. And that's an important piece of it, and that will differ certainly across cultures. But in terms of actually the mechanics, I would say that is, math is math, and there's sort of less argument, I think, on that front.
Thank you. I was interested in that question of whether there were different models for using the math. So thanks.
This is Jason Delborn. I have a question. Given that what you presented is that there's the kind of analytical, mathematical risk assessment world, and then the more perception of risk world.
I'm doing fine. I'm getting educated. Oh yeah.
Well, you need to mute yourself, Wayne.
Sorry. Mute myself.
This is Jason Delborn. I'm not sure if I could be heard before.
I hear you.
Yeah, you're on, Jason.
Thank you. My question is, given that there are these two ways of perceiving risk in terms of more an analytical or computational way, and then more of the perception of risk, do you know of best practices or good models to integrate those ways of understanding risk to lead to good decision making?
Oh, there's a generous literature and considerable practical guidance on that. Trina may have more to know.
Communication, I would say. The key aspect is, and as Bruce pointed out, coming in at the end and presenting this fabulous analysis that was really well done, very detailed, thought of all the possibilities, all of that, but just kind of coming out of nowhere, or so to speak, springing it on the audience, that is never going to be successful. There has to be a give and take. There has to be early communication to facilitate the effective communication of the results, I think.
Because if you don't do that, the decision you want to make, you feel if we make the decision to deploy this technology, it's going to produce this truly impressive public health benefit, and that's true, and you really wanted the decision to be made in that direction. It could not be made because of this failure to communicate, failure to appreciate other people's perceptions, failure to inform early on. Years ago, I worked for a consulting firm that we had a separate group that did risk communication, and when we got a project to do a risk assessment, a calculated risk assessment, this team went out ahead of all of that and talked to everybody, both sides of many sides of the aisle, and that clearly informed. It didn't inform our calculations, but it certainly began the process of how our calculations are going to be used by decision makers to come to the best decision possible. And that was a kind of a unique situation. I mean, there is a very large literature on risk communication. Paul Slovic at the University of Oregon was a leader in this field. Actually, behavioral economists have picked up on it to some extent. The challenge, as both Trina and I have said, is there's all this knowledge out there, but we still don't. How should I say this? It doesn't get applied as much as it should. So again, particularly with this kind of technology, which is fairly hard to describe to the layperson and touches on some areas of extreme controversy, at least in the Western context, and reaching out, communicating, informing early on is, I think, key to, if you want the decision to go toward deploying the technology which you think is going to have very positive public health benefits, then you need to get out in front of this and start talking about and reaching out. And just don't do a risk assessment and a calculation and hope feel that's going to make it all come out good, because it's probably not.
I'll just give the example of years ago I did a risk assessment. It was a waste-to-energy facility, and so there was the potential for air pollution. And it came time to communicate the results to the community. And my boss at the time basically made the comparison. People were concerned, and they thought, well, this is going to lead to adverse effects, and I'm breathing that air, and what's going on? And he basically said, well, it's far less than, for example, waiting when the school bus goes by in the morning and all the at that time diesel and not clean diesel, the fumes and whatnot from that. That's a much higher risk than this facility, and the whole project just blew up and failed because people were like, yeah, well, I want that school bus, and I'll take 8 times the hit from the school bus, but I do not want that facility. And forget it. It wasn't even about the numbers ultimately, because of the way in which he sort of unfortunately chose to communicate it. So that's just an example of the kind of thing that can go on.
Yeah, I've got similar stories.
Hi, this is Lisa Tannehill. Can you hear me?
Yeah.
Oh, great. I just have a question for both of you, a kind of a scenario question. So I was curious if you've ever done a risk assessment or know of anyone that's done a risk assessment for a situation in which there are clear benefits to humans, but there might be adverse effects or risks associated for the environment or from an ecological standpoint. And how, if you have had experience with that, how do you communicate that, and what was the end result in those situations?
So this is where ecosystem services rises right to the top, because that is, and it is human-centric, but it is an explicit acknowledgement of the interaction that humans have with the environment and the importance of the environment on human well-being. And so when we frame these ecological impacts in terms of how it affects the well-being of the community, then you start to make a little headway, if you will, in terms of bringing those ecological effects to the fore. And it's really all about making people understand, and they do understand. You sort of realize, oh yeah, I really like that park, and I like hiking in the woods on the weekends, and I do like visiting the reservoir and seeing the eagles flying overhead, and all those kinds of things. Emphasizing the benefits that the environment provides humans, and emphasizing the interconnection between humans and the environment, and sort of natural capital, green infrastructure. These are the kinds of things you'll hear. And so even if the ecological endpoint is not something that people directly think about, emphasizing to them the importance of that in the overall construct. We can't have the polar bears without the ice caps, without the, sort of showing people how these things are connected. That resonates, and can be a more effective way of communicating and emphasizing the potential negative impacts to the environment relative to the benefits to humans. And this is, again, also where decision analytic approaches can kind of help, not in terms of talking with people, but just internally doing the analysis. Is you can incorporate those kinds of subjective weights and what is important to people. You can incorporate that into a decision analytic framework, and that can actually help sort through some of the alternatives as well.
I think some of the literature on forest management practices, clear cutting, and prescribed burning is a good practical example of, there are many different kinds of human benefits from forests, and some of those human benefits only accrue if you cut down a good chunk of the forest and perhaps threaten the water quality and so on. So that's a rich literature of both calculated and perceived risks and human benefits versus ecological consequences. So if you need some practical examples, that would be one I would start with.
Great, thank you.
Are there any more questions? Well, with that, I would like to thank our speakers for a really informative discussion and presentation today. We will send announcements about the committee's next webinars. I think the next one is on biosecurity, November 19th. There will be announcements going out through people who have registered for these webinars and also through the listserv, which you can sign up for on the Gene Drives website. So thank you again, and until next time.